I am Aaron Ford, and I am your Attorney General. I'm honored to be here today to speak to you about Juneteenth. It's a day in which, according to our own state laws sponsored by and passed by then Assemblyman Harvey Mumford, a day that we commemorate the abolition of slavery in the United States. Juneteenth has an interesting history. And while we celebrate in response to President Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation, it's important to note that abolishing slavery was somewhat of an afterthought. If you know me, I just speak the truth. I appreciate the altruistic outcomes, but sometimes altruistic outcomes are brought about as a matter of necessity. When the American Civil War started in 1861, President Lincoln made it clear that his only goal at the time was to preserve the Union. In fact, in a letter to Horace Greeley, who is the founder and editor of the New York Tribune, President Lincoln said this, and I quote, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. And it is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that too." It eventually, obviously, became obvious that preserving the Union would mean the destruction of slavery. But during the early part of the war, captured slaves were actually held as contraband of war, with the actual expectation that they would eventually be returned to their owners. On January 1, 1863, however, President Lincoln took the critical step of issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. The order freed the slaves in areas occupied by Union armies, but it did not immediately affect those who lived in the 10 states of the Confederacy. And so on June 19th, this day in 1865, 2.5 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union's Major General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, with 2,000 federal troops. He assembled those who were present, and he read General Order Number 3, which informed the people of Texas, including my fourth great-grandmother and my third great-grandparents, I imagine. They were in Texas at the time, in accordance with the Emancipation Proclamation, that the slaves were free. As you might imagine, the then former slaves received the news with great joy, spontaneously organizing a celebration, which was the first celebration of the end of slavery in its entirety in the United States. As the Union troops advanced, the joyous news reached more and more people. One of them you might know, Booker T. Washington. He, at the time, was a 9-year-old boy living in Virginia. And he recalled the events as follows, and I quote, "As the great day grew nearer, there was more singing in the slave quarters than usual. It was bolder and more ring and lasted later into the night. Most of the verses of the plantation songs had some reference to freedom. Some man who seemed to be a stranger, a United States officer, I presume, made a little speech and then read a rather long paper, the Emancipation Proclamation, I think. After the reading, we were told that we were all free and could go when and where we pleased. My mother, who was standing by my side, leaned over and kissed her children while tears of joy ran down her cheek. She explained to us what it all meant. That this was a day for which she had been so long praying, but fearing that she would never live to see. Since that time, Juneteenth has become an important annual tradition in many parts of the country. It's a day to celebrate our ancestors, our heritage, and our history. But as we celebrate Juneteenth today, we need to remember that the Emancipation Proclamation and the victory of the Union in the Civil War marked the end of the institution of slavery, but the struggle for true freedom and equality was just beginning. We know this to be true. especially during these times, we are reminded. And frankly, I'm reminded both mentally and physiologically. I literally have a headache, and it won't go away. The recent killing of George Floyd at the hands of police officers has reopened wounds that have never really healed. And in fact, sometimes they haven't even begun to scab. Police brutality against Black Americans is both age-old and current. Thus, as a member of law enforcement who appreciates the sacrifice of my colleagues, and as a member of society who believes in fairness and accountability, I embrace and acknowledge the fact that conversations around police reform are entirely appropriate and timely. But as I've said before, the time for conversing should be near over, if not already completed. We should already be seeing tangible policies and the consistent enforcement of those policies to create, to restore, and to augment trust between members of law enforcement and the communities that they serve. Indeed, members of the public have the absolute right to believe that the type of interaction that they experience with law enforcement will not depend on the color of their skin, and that if an injustice occurs, the response will be a fair and impartial meting of justice. That's why I'm proud of the conversations, conclusions, and suggestions and solutions revealed thus far during my panels of the Justice and Injustice Forum that I began a few weeks back. Many who have participated have outlined policies they've recommended or have already instituted in the wake of George Floyd's killing. Time, which we do not have, and for which we should not have to wait, will tell if these forums will lead to results. I'm optimistic. That said, I'd like to share my vulnerability during these times like these. Every time this happens, and I get goosebumps. You can't see them right now. These are bad goosebumps. They always cause me to exist in an uncomfortable, consistent, persistent, and virtually perpetual state of anxiety. In part because I sense our country simultaneously being on the precipice of both progress and pandemonium. And you never know which way we're going to go. Will the protests and what's being sought through them be considered and received with open minds and thereafter acted upon? Or will the naysayers and those who oppose actual progress hone in on the actions of a few who attempt to co-opt the conversation, to divert attention away from it, to undermine it, and to drown out the concerns being raised? Will people and politicians take these concerns seriously and respond with changes in the enforcement of laws, policies, and practices? Or will they bide their time and actually do what they've done before, which is wait for the fervor to die down and simply continue with the status quo? Again, only time will tell. But honestly, as we wait for time to tell, anxiety continues to permeate parts of my life, because I'm forced to renew my personal concerns for my son's safety. My sons, I have 3 of them and a nephew that we've raised. And I worry about their safety, and not to mention my wife's and my sanity. We're scared. So are my sons. These are emotions I don't wish on anyone. Yet these emotions are consistently recurring, and they appear to be chronic in my life, and I suspect the lives of most Black Americans. To say, however, that these concerns are born purely out of personal or vicarious experiences with law enforcement belies the truth. And it minimizes, if not wholly negates, the fact that this is a systemic problem. We must address the fact that we've created an entire criminal justice system that statistics show, for example, discriminatorily applies discretion and or benefit of the doubt when it comes to whether an officer arrests an individual, whether a prosecutor charges him, and if so, with what. And if a judge sentences him, and if so, to what? Reform of the entire criminal justice system, therefore, is a key and necessary component of this conversation about systemic racism. But beyond the criminal justice system, we must also address the fact that similar discriminatory practices and policies, sorry y'all, I don't have a podium, so I'm doing the best I can, and other aspects of the system of our democracy contain systemic racism as well. To deny that fact likewise negates the well-documented discriminatory practices that exist in our education, economic, housing, and employment systems, just to name a few. And it also ignores the fact that our political system also shares blame in perpetuating systemic racism. I'm about to share some things that may have me lose some friends, maybe even some acquaintances as well. But some of our elected leaders continue to contribute to the problem, either actively or passively, or willingly or unwittingly, and sometimes all of the above. I don't have to talk about politicians outside of Nevada to provide examples. And frankly, I don't have to go back decades to find these examples. Each event that I'm about to describe to you has happened since I was first elected to public office in 2012. In fact, I wrote about many of them in a 2013 opinion piece that I wrote entitled "A Conversation All Too Common." I mean, speaking of slavery, which today is the day that we commemorate the abolition of it, consider the fact that I once had to explain to my sons why a former legislative colleague of mine was taped saying that if his constituents wanted him to, he'd vote to bring back slavery. The quintessential example of a racist system. Further, consider that I've also had to discuss with my sons why another legislative colleague of mine would have the audacity to, as he says, provocatively write, in essence, that blacks aren't grateful enough to whites for their roles in ending slavery. And then consider that I also had to talk to my sons about yet another legislative colleague of mine who said on the radio regarding an upcoming election at the time that he actually hoped that minorities and young folks wouldn't vote, even though exercising the right to vote is undoubtedly one of the best ways to help dismantle systemic racism. And then consider the fact that each of these former colleagues of mine were either or would later become elected leaders of their legislative caucus. Then maybe you'll understand a little bit why I have this perpetual headache. To their credit, the colleagues about which I speak now apologized for their comments. Two of them actually apologized to me directly, and one even called me to ask that I relay his apology to my sons. That their judgment, in my estimation, was so compromised that they could even allow themselves to utter those words, however, is problematic, and in my estimation, it contributes to a systemic racism in ways that we see and that we don't see. At the end, maybe the aspirin of equality will soothe my headache, and maybe one day I'll be able to cope better. Right now, though, it feels like a migraine, and it keeps me up at night, and it wakes me up in the morning. It's unfair, it's unjust, it's improper, and it's problematic, not to mention painful. Now, make no mistake about it, I show my vulnerability not to whine, but to let you know that I remain undaunted, that the showing today represents an opportunity of a way forward. And I'm encouraged by you being here today to celebrate Juneteenth and also to speak out against recent events. I ask that you continue doing that and know that I stand with you. So again, thank you so much for having me out. Shelley Berkeley, thank you, Toro.